Greetings, programs, and welcome back to the TV thing. And this is actually following quite close to the last one, but Enterprise had 90 odd episodes to get through, and this thing I've just been watching only had 13, so obviously that makes quite a difference. Now, what I'm going to talk about today is an anime, and it's called Elfen Lead, and honestly, I really don't know where to start with this one. It's interesting. Let's put it that way. Yes. Now, this is, like so many anime, an adaptation of a manga series, and in the case of Elfen Lead, it's one of these ones where it was actually produced during the run of the manga, so they actually differ in some regards. There are some differences in plot and the ending, apparently. Now, of course, I've not read the manga, but this is all according to Wikipedia, and it kind of makes sense. I do have, experience of other things where you've got adaptations that differ in different ways, and like the prime example I can think of is Nausicaa of the Valley of the Wind, where the film version made by Studio Ghibli, or well, it's kind of like considered the first Studio Ghibli film. I'm not sure if Studio Ghibli technically existed at that point, but that's got nothing to do with anything. Anyway, that was made whilst the graphic novel, or whatever you want to call it, manga series, was being published, and there are some notable differences between the two, even though you can look at the first, it's something like volume and a half or 2 volumes or something of the graphic novel, and you can see a lot of similarities, but it then unfolds a lot more stuff. There's a lot more plot that comes afterwards, whereas the film version just kind of it wraps things up at a certain point, whereas when you get to that certain point in the graphic novel version, it's kind of a transitionary point, but it's not the kind of like final note of anything by any means. And I suspect there's a lot of that going on in Elfen Lied as well, because the manga has apparently run for 107 volumes, or it did run for 107 volumes. Well, actually, I don't know if it is volumes. It says 107 chapters, and I don't know what that means exactly, but I think that will mean volumes. And being manga, it'll mean, smaller volumes. We're not talking big, huge, massive. I'm trying to think of a suitable comparison here, but I really can't. But anyway, yes. So it has to do what some adaptations unfortunately do, and they cram a lot into not a lot of space, and I think it honestly suffers quite a lot for that. This is my biggest overriding impression of Elfen Lied. It's not the violence, it's not the nudity, it's not the gore, it's how jumbled it is thematically. It's how mixed together everything is, and it really is quite jarring when you're watching this sometimes. You'll go from a scene that's meant to be humorous or cutesy or whatever, and then the very next scene, like, something really horrible happens, and it's all over the place. It really is. Now, I did like some things about it. I mean, it's trying to, like I said, it's trying to get a lot in, and the manga probably does it a lot better just because it's got more space to work with these themes. But it's a show where you could say, it's kind of a twisted love story, kind of, but it's also a story about a loss of innocence. That's a very major theme. It's a story about cruelty. It's a story about friendship. It's a story about people being horrible to each other in quite I can't really say too much without giving away major plot points, but at one point it very graphically shows basically child abuse, and it's really quite horrible, and it does it in a really unflinching way, and the whole show is like that. It is an unflinching vision of what's happening in this story. It really pulls no punches whatsoever. The opening episode, where the one of the main characters, Lucy, who is one of these Diclonius, she's basically kind of like I don't know if you call her a mutant or a kind of evolved human in some way, but the Diclonius basically have these powers that are revealed to be invisible arms, which I don't know. You just got to kind of go with it, I guess. And they tend to be very aggressive. They get to a certain age, these powers suddenly manifest, which sounds a bit X-Men-ish. And at that point, generally, they start killing people. And so the Japanese government, I guess it's supposed to be the government, so I don't think they ever actually explicitly say, but they've got this facility on a little remote island somewhere where they've got a bunch of these Diclonius, and as for any others that get found that are born in the population, they tend to kill them as infants. So there's a lot of heavy stuff in this show. There really is. So yeah, the opening is Lucy, this Diclonius, escapes from this facility, and she's basically naked for this entire sequence. She's ripping people from limb, and it's all shown in fairly graphic detail. There's copious amounts of blood. There's even one moment where this kind of klutzy, ditzy secretary type unwittingly stumbles into the middle of this, like all the guards trying to stop Lucy, and Lucy just kind of casually rips her head off and then uses her corpse as a bullet shield. This is not a show for the squeamish. It really isn't. Like, if you can't get past that first episode, then you really shouldn't watch the rest of it. I think the first episode has the most concentrated amount of violence, but there's still quite a lot of it throughout the rest of the thing. Now, like I've said, I thought it was interesting in a lot of ways, but just from how much they were trying to pack into it, I honestly have a hard time recommending this as something for people to go and watch. Even if you weren't put off by the fact that there's all this nudity and blood everywhere, it's quite hard to keep track. Sometimes you end up with narrative whiplash just because it changes pace, it changes gear so quickly, and it makes for a very discordant experience when you're trying to follow what's going on. And I suspect they wanted to make a longer series, but it's probably just been a budgetary thing. Like, they were told, this is how much money you've got, which was enough for X number of episodes, and they had to do their best with what they had. So this is actually one of those things where maybe it might be interesting to go and read the manga, but it's unlikely to happen, because I'm sure buying that many volumes would be probably rather expensive. So I would like to see, what the story is like in a more unpacked context, what it's like when the various plot points have got more room to breathe, and it doesn't feel like quite such a roller coaster. But it's unlikely that I'm ever going to be able to do that, or that I ever will get round to doing that, even if I magically ended up having enough cash to buy 100 and odd volumes of this thing. Although it's probably been collected into, fewer, but still, it's kind of like it's the kind of thing where it's I can see why it's notorious, and I actually have a hard time saying whether or not it was gratuitous in terms of the amount of violence and the amount of nudity. There were certain bits of it, certain scenes where it's like, well, was that really necessary? Did that really add anything, or was it just like titillation? For the most part, I don't think that was true, but for some scenes, yeah, maybe. So if the manga is the same, then possibly I wouldn't enjoy it, even despite the fact that there's a lot of interesting thematic stuff potentially going on. Now, one thing I would draw a comparison to, in fact, two things I draw a comparison to. First is Dune, and this is more in terms of talking about adaptations of things, because of course we've had a very famous film version of Dune, and personally I love it. I love how the film is stylized. I love some of the performances, although not all of them. I love the soundtrack, but it had to make certain sacrifices to compact the again, thematically very complex story of Dune, Frank Herbert's novel, and cram that into the space of what is still a fairly long film, but is not as long as the reputed first cut was. There's all kinds of legends that go around about the kind of early cuts of that film and how long they were. But the final product was interesting but very, very flawed. And the comparison I want to make specifically is with the 2000s sci-fi miniseries, where they did, I think they did Dune and Children of Dune. I think they kind of folded the first 3 books into 2 miniseries, if I'm remembering correctly. I might not be. But yeah, in a lot of ways, it was the more bland-looking show, or show, adaptation of Dune. Like, for me, the 80s film version is by far, like, it's fantastic. It just looks wonderful. And the entire feel of the universe is something that the miniseries just doesn't capture. But what the miniseries does do is tell the story a hell of a lot better because it's got more room to work with. So it's one of these things where, like, maybe if Elfen Lied, the anime, had more episodes to work with, it would have been better. It would have been a bit less confusing in places, a bit less hard to keep up with what was meant to be going on at any given moment. But I guess we'll never know unless it somehow gets adapted again at some point. I don't know if they tend to do that with anime. I mean, I guess manga's such a big thing in Japan that there's always something new to actually go and produce instead of just rehashing old stuff. Well, the second comparison I really wanted to make was Let the Right One In. And I've never seen the Hollywood remake, but I have seen the Swedish original film, and I think I've read the book as well. Although if I have, it was a while ago. But that does share quite a lot of the themes of, especially the kind of the loss of innocence themes and the kind of whole sort of twisted romance that's going on. I wouldn't really necessarily call what Elfen Lied has a twisted romance, but it's hard to say how it's similar exactly. But there are, in my eyes, definite similarities between the two. And I think Let the Right One In does it a lot better because it concentrates more on just a couple of things. It's not throwing in, the potential fate of humanity and all this kind of thing. But there are a lot of similarities in terms of, like, it's talking about how people treat each other when they're different, sort of that kind of level of thing. So I would say, maybe don't necessarily go and watch Elfen Lied, but you probably should give Let the Right One In a go. Certainly the Swedish version, and I think the book is very good as well. I'm sure I've read it. I'm sure I have. I've just read so many books over the years, it's sometimes hard to keep track. So there we are, another anime. It was really just one I picked randomly off Netflix. It looked like it had decent user reviews, so I gave it a go. And yeah, I wouldn't watch it again, but it was interesting. As for what I'll watch next, I don't really know. I guess we'll see. Just whatever else catches my eye. I mean, I do have some recommendations from people to maybe look up online and see if I can find things there as well. So yeah, it might just be something I picked randomly on Netflix, or it might be something that somebody's recommended to me, or who knows. I did want to add a little note at the end of this before I wrap things up. I've been pondering doing films as well, but honestly, I mean, I wouldn't really consider myself a film critic in any sense. I'm not really a critic in any sense at all. I'm just doing videos on stuff I've been watching and reading that's been interesting to me. And by that criteria, there are films that I watch quite often that potentially I could sit down and talk about, except I've decided that I would quite like this channel to be more focused on longer form narrative content. And obviously, that suits books and longer TV series quite well because you get to see a lot more development of story, a lot more development of character. And that's really what I'm interested in. And it's not to say that I don't like watching films as well, because I do. I watch quite a lot of films, but films are a different format in that regard. Films have a lot less space to work with, so they have to do things in certain ways. And I don't know. I just don't really feel like I want to mix and match there. It's more that long form content that I am really interested in when it comes to storytelling. So I'm gonna stick with just TV and books for the time being. But who knows? At some point, I might change my mind and decide that I really, really want to talk about a particular film. I might just do it as a very occasional thing. I don't know. I was very tempted to do something on Star Trek Beyond, and then I decided, actually, no, I'm okay having just watched it. I don't necessarily feel like I have to sit down and dissect it. So hopefully you've found this this latest video interesting, and if you have, you can leave any comments below. You can hit the like button, you can sub to my channel if you haven't already, and as always, stay tuned for more.